The 60s were a decade of demand for change, but in many cases, the real change happened in the 1970s.
Whether it was the war, sort of the continuation of the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, women's rights, gay rights. Here in Minnesota in the Midwest, it was during the 1970s where that stuff was really coming together.
If we ask people what they remember about the 1970s, people are more likely to laugh first, and only if we push the question to remember the more significant or serious aspects of the decade.
Change started with the decade's first election. Democrat Wendell Anderson was elected in November of 1970 on a platform built on property tax reform. After a long struggle, public buy-in forced Republicans to the negotiating table. A bipartisan effort to shift the burden of school funding from local to state resources culminated in what the nation praised as a Minnesota miracle. The face of Minnesota politics changed in 1972 with the election of a half-dozen women to the legislature, including Joan Grow, Phyllis Kahn, and Linda Berglund. Another barrier was broken when State Senator Alan Speer came out in 1974, becoming one of the first openly gay politicians in America. During the decade, the state's communities of color built on the momentum of the civil rights movement. The American Indian movement grew out of Minnesota to become a confrontational catalyst for change. In the 70s, on a range of issues, Minnesota was propelled forward by people power. At the dawn of the decade, students at the University of Minnesota were among those to usher in the first annual Earth Day in 1970.
University students in Minneapolis chose that approach.
The ecology movement that had been building through the 20th century would reshape American policy, industry, and attitude in the 1970s. This was seen in memorable moments of popular culture, like the decade's pervasive anti-pollution public service announcements, or in the locally produced cult classic indie video, Attack of the Burger Pods. But students, Hollywood, and hippies weren't the only ones involved. In Minnesota, the spirit of environmentalism has always come in many guises.
And I've oftentimes said one of the ways to happiness is living closer to the earth.
A 72-year-old love affair with the wilderness has caused Sigurd Olson to enter dozens of battles to preserve the land.
I hope that 100 years from now, people can still stand on this point and look out across those beautiful islands and not see them completely cluttered with developments of all kinds.
Another northern Minnesota resident would be drawn into the environmental movement in order to protect her beloved Great Lake.
When I was a child, my solace was sitting there and watching the waves come in.
Arlene Lado, a hairdresser and housewife from the North Shore, would become a surprising leader in the reserve mining case, one of the most contentious environmental battles in the state's history.
And it was so clear and blue, and you could get a drink of water, you know, right out of the lake. You didn't have to worry about anything. It was very clean and clear water. I married a young Air Force sergeant, and we moved around from West Coast to East Coast. And after 11 years, we came back, and the water is no longer clear. And it's the taconite plant that was at Silver Bay.
Reserve Mining Company was a steady employer in the area. The plant extracted iron out of taconite, a process that resulted in massive amounts of taconite tailings that it then dumped into Lake Superior.
We talked it over and said, yeah, we need an organization. And we decided that night it would be to save Lake Superior. And that's where the name came from. There were tensions, of course. When people think their jobs are at risk, and that was the mining company, and yes, there were tensions. I was threatened verbally a lot, but only one night was I threatened physically, and that's when somebody tried to run me off the road.
The hairdresser and mom-turned-activist made another shrewd move in a presentation to a high-profile hearing in Duluth. She had prepared a speech for the hearing, but on the day before, she had met a geologist from the University of Wisconsin who pointed out an eye-opening article in the journal Science.
He says, this is an asbestos fiber, what it looks like. And this is the Minnesotaite that is in Reserve Mining Company's discharge, then in their tailings. And he said, I just noticed a real similarity between those two. So I quick wrote these words down on a little piece of paper I had, and I wrote a new paragraph and inserted it in, just asking the question. And that's all I did. I didn't make a statement that this is asbestos. I said, we don't even know if this material is causing any health problems.
Arlene's presentation was a game changer. The possibility that the tailings were more than unsightly pollution, but might be a serious health hazard, raised the stakes.
Scientists started looking at it, and they came up with the conclusion, yes, it's asbestiform material. Army Corps of Engineers brought water up here for pregnant women and children.
The Environmental Protection Agency brought suit, and in the spring of 1974, after the longest environmental trial in U.S. history, Judge Miles Lord ruled against reserve mining, and eventually the dumping of taconite tailings came to an end. The reserve mining decision rippled across the country. America had reached the tipping point on pollution, environmental issues, and water quality. In the 1970s, policies offered restoration and protection for the lower St. Croix, the Mississippi River in the metro, and the Boundary Waters canoe area.
I hope regulations will keep the water pure and the campsites clean.
Citizen action is what it's all about. I didn't have a scientific background. What I had was anger that they're dirtying my lake. I think the legacy is that an ordinary person can do something.
In the early 70s, if you looked towards downtown Minneapolis from the four corners of the metro area, you could see the state was on the rise. Most agree the IDS building is a towering achievement in architecture, a symbol of the state's enterprise. As the 1970s began, there were several big ideas on the drawing boards for Minnesota. Some bold visions were built, some were tempered by pushback from the people they would impact. All symbolized the grand plans of the 70s. In the late 60s and early 70s, the newly formed Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, was supporting ambitious new community development projects across the country. In Minnesota, this included the Ralph Rapson-designed Cedar Square West project. The project's invasive urban renewal plans ran into the now well-formed protest culture of the 70s.
A look at the original plans and drawings, the amount of space that was going to be cleared in that part of Minneapolis, Cedar Riverside, and replaced by this futuristic-looking set of buildings is simply staggering.
The third largest building in Minneapolis. It's part of Cedar Square West, a huge development that is edging out the old buildings and the old community, for better or for worse.
Riverside Plaza, which is 1,300 units, was the first of 10 phases of similar scale. So it was going to be a massive project.
Tim Mungavin was among those in the West Bank area of Minneapolis who pushed back against the bold plans.
What was called the Newtown in-town was an extremely high-density experiment that had no precedent within the city. And even Riverside Plaza, which did get built, is the most dense four-block area in the upper Midwest outside of Chicago. So it sort of was plonking down a whole new idea in the middle of a very different kind of world.
Late last week, some residents proposed a community development corporation that would offer the housing authority alternatives to current development plans.
That was a real exciting time when we began to figure out how to use a real grassroots process that came out of the tenant union to do redevelopment planning.
The next 9 phases of the new town plan were never developed. Foreclosure, then renovation, the changing face of tenants. Riverside Plaza continues to evolve. In the 70s, it wasn't just people on Minneapolis's West Bank who were challenging the state's blueprints for change.
There's not been any violence out here. The violence is coming when they're running this line through.
Farmers in western Minnesota fought a years-long battle to stop massive power lines from slicing through their land. They couldn't stop the project, but their cause and their methods caught the eye of a young Carleton College professor named Paul Wellstone, who would later bring this grassroots activism to Washington as a U.S. Senator. And then there were the plans for a brand new futuristic city of 250,000 people to spring up in the fields of rural Minnesota. Planners and lawmakers were quickly moving forward on the project, but so were protesting residents of the potential sites from Fergus Falls to Aiken County. Like the full-scale plan for Cedar Riverside, the Minnesota experimental city didn't get past the blueprints and plans. But work on a suburban new town did get underway. If you find yourself in Chaska, near Lake Grace, you might notice some curious landmarks, neighborhoods futuristically defined by a number, a decidedly 70s community logo, even a designated slope for sledding. These are the artifacts of a planned community called Jonathan. The satellite city was the vision of businessman and state senator Henry T. McKnight, who had high hopes for the planned community where technology, the environment, and as many as 50,000 souls would live in communal harmony. But the death of McKnight, cuts in federal spending on these projects, and the sagging economy of the mid-70s ended the big dreams for Jonathan. While the original project was foreclosed on, there had already been considerable development and families had bought homes and moved in. It became a neighborhood association in the city of Chaska. But still, there are those vestiges of the grand vision. The house numbers are long. They were to double as ISP-like addresses for an interlinked telecom system, an early internet. Tunnels under roadways limit the need for traffic control, and like the pedestrian paths that thread the community together, promote open space and a walkable community. But you'll notice more than curious 70s design in Jonathan. You'll see what appears to be a very livable community. Images that suggest some of the vision behind this grand plan just might have been met after all. The way people did business in Minnesota went through dramatic changes in the 70s.
Throughout the decade, you're seeing some of the old school industries fading out. The meatpacking industry in South St. Paul, companies like Minneapolis Moline shutting down, some of the big breweries, they're shutting down at that time.
Minnesota technology companies helped bring the information age to America. There is one constant in Minnesota commerce.
Ho, ho, ho. Green Giant.
From the flour mills in Minneapolis to the familiar products of General Mills, food business has always been big business in Minnesota.
And the food industry, that is the food retail industry, was organized nationwide around regional chains. And as the decade began, cities around Minnesota were simply saturated with supermarkets.
The tight economy and rising inflation forced regional chains like Red Owl and National to battle for the shrinking budgets of Minnesotans. Then the emergence of the no-frills big box grocery warehouses signaled an existential challenge to these stores. Those food factions fought it out through severe price cutting and breathless marketing in what local press described as food wars. But another front in the food wars was opening in the 70s.
We see first in the Twin Cities, but by the end of the 1970s, there are co-ops everywhere from Mankato to Winona and from Marshall to Grand Marais.
It was just a time of foment in America, and the food co-op was just one of the movements that grew out of it.
Lori Zeidema came of age in the early 70s, just as the burgeoning food cooperatives were taking root.
We knew we were against sexism and racism and poverty and war, but it was harder to articulate what we were for. The food co-op movement was something I could finally jump on board. You know, one thing that was very appealing was that women could be in positions of power in co-ops. Young people could be in positions of power easily. And plus it was cheap, and we were very poor in those days. And so the idea of cheap food oatmeal that was 2 cents a pound, we could load it into a bag and get a big bag of oatmeal for like 25 cents. People that join a co-op actually buy a membership share, and that means you get to vote. You are the membership, just like a stockholder in a corporation. So I started stopping by Seward and shopping there and getting to know the people there a little bit, and I volunteered to cut cheese on Thursday night. I just was working there cutting cheese one night, and somebody said, "Do you want to be a coordinator? There's an opening." And I said, "Sure."
The pioneering co-ops you would find across Minnesota in the 70s were far from the nicely appointed co-ops of today.
People today would be amazed at what we got by with in those days. It was very bare bones. Plus, most of the retail co-ops were old convenience stores, and so the equipment was substandard. We didn't have money for improvements. We just would kind of patch it up and fix it up the best we could.
The People's Bakery.
Alternative food businesses were beginning to catch the eye of mainstream Minnesota.
And their motto, flour to the people.
Despite the low prices and the management's focus on social justice, there were some who felt the co-ops weren't accessible enough, or at least not in the way that met their political agenda.
The CO stood for Co-op Organization. It was a group of, well, they called themselves revolutionary activists, and it was part of a larger political agenda that just happened to target food co-ops. Some of the stores willingly, like the Beanery, willingly became co-op organization strongholds. But for some of them, it wasn't happening. At Seward, for example, it wasn't happening. And so they decided they had to use force. So they came in and they took Seward by force. They threw out the storekeepers, locked the doors, and said they were going to make it a people's store, and that our time was up. But then they also took over the People's Warehouse. The People's Warehouse was a distribution center that had started to service the growing network of retail co-ops.
The People's Warehouse was taken over by a group of people who were not fulfilling all of the food needs of the cooperative community.
So there was a lot of going back and forth. There was a lot of meetings, and eventually the CO was overthrown and the People's Warehouse was retaken. It did kind of die down, and some of the CO people that were still strongly committed to it moved to other cities, and some of the stores that had been CO strongholds, like the Beanery, ended up folding.
Like Lori, several co-op founders remained in the movement, often moving from one natural foods organization to another. As they gained experience and business acumen, some of the original co-ops grew into the high-end, multi-million-dollar enterprises that we know today.
Coming into the co-ops for me at that time was a life-changing experience.
Minnesota became something of a cultural oasis during the 70s. This arrival on the art scene was announced by the opening of the Walker Art Center's new building in 1971. Minnesota's up-and-coming visual artists were captured by photographer Victor Bloomfield. His photos present now familiar names like Tom Rose, Jerry Rudquist, and the artists who created WARM, the Women's Art Resources of Minnesota, in the 70s. Public TV and radio expanded their services throughout the 70s, introducing some familiar voices and faces and conveying the wide array of arts and cultural endeavors that flourished during the decade.
And our directors can recognize that the human complexion is multicolored.
In Minneapolis, Mixed Blood Theater staged unique multicultural work. Across the river, Penumbra Theater began its decades-long life in St. Paul's historic African-American community. Penumbra's stage was an extension of the civil rights and black power movements of the times.
Those giants like Josie Johnson She will bring me to task on the work that I do. Mahmoud el-Khati, those people fought a wonderful fight so that I could have this ability to speak.
Music in Minnesota would take a giant leap in the 70s, and the breadth and depth of the decade's music was captured under one roof. This ivy-covered building in Minneapolis was originally built as the recording studio called Sound 80.
A lot of good stuff has come out of here. Good music and interesting stuff, and things we believe could not have been done anywhere else.
In the mid-50s, a gifted German-born musician named Herb Pilhofer came to study at the University of Minnesota. The jazz musician and composer became the musical director for the Guthrie Theater when it opened in 1962. Pilhofer would eventually become a key composer at K-Bank, one of the few recording studios in the Twin Cities. But he and sound techs Tom Jung, Gary Erickson, and Scott Rivard longed for a new musical playground.
We sat down one night and said, you know, why don't we just build our own? It seemed very innocent, right? But we went to the bank and got a loan. And the city gave us a lot, this lot here, for $5,000, I think we paid for this lot. And we ended up building a studio.
Herb Pilhofer was a Renaissance man as far as music went. But in many ways, he was sometimes best known for what we would call jingles. Herb really does not like that term at all.
I didn't like the jingly sort of singing things.
He was very good at it.
I hated that with a passion, actually.
I've been told that he was the one behind the Golden Grahams commercial.
Let's eat. Oh, those golden grahams.
Oh, those golden grahams.
Golden honey, just a touch.
That's how they paid the bills, especially during the early years.
Occasional Sound 80 producer David Zimmerman connected the studio staff with his older brother, Bob Zimmerman. The Iron Ranger, also known as Bob Dylan, recorded some of his legendary Blood on the Tracks album at Sound 80.
There's a picture of all three of us Commandos around a ribbon mic. We were pretending amongst ourselves that that was Bob Dylan's mic from the Blood on the Tracks session, which happened, I think, just before we came in.
Burn it down!
Another band that recorded at Sound 80 was the Suicide Commandos. Punk rock had come to the prairie, and the West Metro Trio was burning up stages at home and around the country.
The 70s were musically exciting because there were a lot of music movements that were happening, and some of them we were very reactive to, like disco. This was it? This was it? Okay. Yeah, Studio One. Got it so nondescript on the outside. You know, you're pulling up to a cinder block building amongst a forest of other cinder block buildings, and then you get out and you walk in and suddenly you're where the magic happens. Yep. I am so fond of telling people these days that it was really, really fun to make a living making a kind of music that everybody hated.
From punk and new wave, folk, rock, and R&B to Herb's own creative fusion records, Sound 80 was ground zero for much of Minnesota music in the 70s.
Also on a national level, Cat Stevens recorded most, if not all, of Is It So here at Sound 80.
Here's the Cat Stevens album that he did.
The Cat Stevens sessions made an impression on the staff, but so did another artist working at the studio at that time.
Prince. David Rifkin, the sound engineer, realized pretty early that this was a really special artist. He had never seen anything like this. They were amazing sessions, apparently.
Prince took the demo he recorded at Sound 80 to Los Angeles, where he was signed by Warner Brothers and produced his first album. But Sound 80 had one thing that LA and New York didn't, a hometown company that was on the cutting edge of recording technology.
3M Company, which at that time was a supplier of tape, they had developed the digital recording technology, but it offered us a tremendous opportunity.
The Sound 80 team used the new technology in sessions with the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra. The record became the first commercial digital recording to win a Grammy Award in 1980. Despite reaching this pinnacle in the wide range of work and commercial success of Sound 80, the studio hadn't yet recorded a popular hit record. Then local musician Stephen Greenberg came to the studios to start work on a disco album for his band Lips Inc., featuring a very infectious dance song. By the summer of 1980, Sound 80 could claim its role in a #1 pop hit as Funkytown topped the Billboard charts. Ironically, the song isn't an ode to Minnesota, as most believe. In fact, it's just the opposite.
Funkytown is a get-me-out-of-this-place type of anthem. Funkytown is not Minneapolis. Funkytown is not St. Paul. Funkytown is any place other than the Twin Cities.
Gotta Move On also describes where the principals of Sound 80 were at the time. Herb and chief engineer Tom Jung were heading in separate creative directions. The studio space was sold and is now a research lab.
This building, it has so much history. It was not just a studio, a building. It was really a gathering place of a lot of talented people. We had a great run with Sound 80.
The DFL had a good run too, but by the late 70s, that had ended. By the dawn of the 80s, Minnesota, like the nation, had veered right and elected Republican Al Quie as governor and Rudy Boschwitz and Dave Dernberger to the U.S. Senate. But the North Star State had been transformed during the decade, a result of ambitious planning, cultural progress, and the impact of people power that characterized Minnesota in the 70s.
Minnesota in the 70s is the Minnesota Partnership co-production of Minnesota Historical Society Press, publisher of the history and culture of Minnesota and the Upper Midwest, through books, Minnesota History Journal, and the digital encyclopedia Minnepedia, and Twin Cities Public Television. Funding provided by the Elmer L. and Eleanor Anderson Publications Fund of the Minnesota Historical Society.